you look at the data on mental well-being and suicide. We'll see how it develops, but there's real cause for concern there. And so having these brave first people to the table when there is a huge array of elite America against them, to have the courage to step up and say, this was all a lie and it has been horrible for me, it provides a counter narrative.
Tennessee Attorney General Jonathan Skrmetti is my guest this week. We are on location in a great part of the American South, and I can't tell you how much I've been looking forward, General Skrmetti, to having this conversation. You are a great American, and really looking forward to the conversation and also what you'll be doing in the future. Thanks for joining me.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
You're in the news.
It was a big day yesterday.
It was. Tell us about that.
So we have been very concerned with the regulatory overreach from the Biden administration. And I think the apotheosis of that overreach has been the Title IX rule. It is a sweeping rule. Their proposed regulation would have radically changed American education. They were incorporating gender identity into the sex discrimination prohibition. They were expanding the scope of what was covered. They had a de minimis standard. It would have been a really totalitarian intrusion into every American school and university. We sued to enjoin it. We successfully enjoined it. We litigated that injunction all the way up to the Supreme Court. And then yesterday, the trial court vacated the rule for us. So that means it is as if it never existed. The rule is gone. President Trump will have a clean slate when he comes in. So we're feeling really good about that win.
So what do you think, based on the totality of that victory, the future holds for this issue of violating the very mission of Title IX? In other words, where I'm going with that, which you no doubt know, but maybe to mention for the audience is, I know there's some concern in conservative circles, especially conservative legal circles, about the yo-yo that exists between Republican and Democratic presidential administrations.
Well, I think we have a constitutional structure designed to prohibit that yo-yoing. And the fact that we see more and more of the back and forth is a sign of the breakdown of that structure. It's the Wilsonian replacement of our separation of powers regime with a technocratic bureaucracy. And this is the Constitution reasserting itself. When you force the legislative process to happen, you take away the ability of the instant ping-ponging. You need two houses of Congress plus a president to make anything happen that's a massive substantive change to American law. And by trying to backdoor these big changes through the regulatory process, you eliminate the need for consensus, you eliminate the transparency, you eliminate the public participation in the process, and ultimately you alienate Americans from their government, which is the cardinal sin that led to the creation of the United States. So it's my sincere hope that this case and the many other regulatory cases that have been brought by a variety of attorneys general are going to really force structural change in the approach of every executive branch. At some point, even people coming at this from the left are going to realize that doing big changes through regulation is futile.
So, in short, the system is still working, in spite of the fact that it's under some strain, to say the least. And for those of us who are philosophically conservative, we might say that our movement is ascendant, but it also sounds like underlying your response there is that we've got some work to do. And tell me, I mean, it really is open-ended question. You're more the expert on this than I am. It sounds like the work that needs to be done is that Congress has got to reassert its authority in order for this system to continue to work.
So this is going to sound completely insane in a conservative context, but Congress needs more resources. When you look at the size and scope of the executive branch, Congress doesn't have the muscle to exert real oversight. It doesn't have nearly the degree of expertise necessary to craft complicated legislation. And so it's really easy to punt it to the agencies. You don't have to deal with the accountability. You don't have to have the expertise. You let other people do the work. We need a Congress that is resourced enough to step in and be the counterweight. Right now, the states are really the big check on the executive branch working through the judiciary. But our system depends on every piece pushing against every other piece. And federalism only goes so far. At some point, we need a legislative branch that is capable and willing to assert its prerogatives as both a co-equal branch and, in theory, the preeminent branch that speaks with the voice of the people.
I want to come back to this topic of federalism, which is important to you, given your work, also given the philosophy that we share. It's obviously important to Heritage. But before we do that, I'm very fond of figuring out someone's story. And one of the great customs we have on this show, because of the wonderful, high-quality guests, is talking about their story. How in the world did you find yourself one day waking up being the Attorney General of Tennessee?
It is objectively insane, and I'm grateful every morning. I literally wake up laughing many mornings.
You're laughing
thinking,
now.
Lord, how did you bring me to this place? I grew up in Connecticut. I went to the Department of Justice after law school, and they sent me to Memphis. And that was where most of my docket was. I had a great mentor in the U.S. Attorney's Office there. There was a really active, unfortunately, public corruption docket there. A lot of police officers up to things they shouldn't have been.
Long history of corruption in Memphis.
Yeah. So it was a great place to be a federal prosecutor. And I went back and forth for about 5 years for Main Justice, and felt like a prosecutor can make a big difference in Memphis. So I moved down with the intention of being a career AUSA. Met my wife very shortly thereafter. We got married. We started having kids. For financial reasons, I had to go into private practice. So I did that. And after about 5 years of that, I got a cold call from a recruiter who said, the Attorney General of Tennessee is looking for a new chief deputy. Would you be interested in talking? And it was out of I never thought I'd move to Nashville. I never thought I'd work in state government. So I took the interview. I got the job. We moved to Franklin, and I was the chief deputy for a while. I was hoping I could parlay it into a judgeship. That was the big overarching plan there. The governor hired me to be his counsel, and then I thought, well, I'll do this for a while, and then maybe I can parlay that into a judgeship. And then the Attorney General decided he didn't want to re-up. And in Tennessee, we have a unique system where the Supreme Court picks the Attorney General. So instead
That is unique.
There are many criticisms out there. It is a great system. It has worked very well for us. It's also an 8-year term, which is phenomenal. So there was a 2-week window. I spent about the first week trying to talk someone else into applying for the job. And when he didn't do it, I started getting a lot of phone calls encouraging me to think about it. I was up till 3 a.m. getting the application done before the deadline, zipped it in, and a couple weeks later, I was picked to be the Attorney General.
And how far are you into your term?
2 years.
So you must have family in Connecticut saying, Jonathan, this is objectively insane.
So actually, my dad's from Biloxi, Mississippi. Most of my
Which
family
means he's
down
a great
on the Gulf
American.
Coast. Well, yeah, most of the time, yeah. No, he's a great patriot. He joined the Navy. He enlisted right out of high school, and that's how he ended up in Connecticut. We don't have any family up in Connecticut anymore. My folks live in Tennessee. My sister currently lives in Tennessee. She's probably moving to New York soon, unfortunately. And then we got a lot of family on the coast, and then a few relatives up in New England and other parts. But by and large, we've got the only grandkids on either side of the family, so we're the magnet right now.
As this I was going to say might sound like a digression. We specialize in digressions in these conversations on this show. I'm a Gulf Coast guy, and so recently when President Trump said that he was going to rename the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America, I thought, man, that's awesome. But of course, all my Texas friends said, no, Kevin, it needs to be renamed the Gulf of Texas. But Gulf of America is a little more ecumenical for all of the other folks who live in different states on the Gulf. In all seriousness, it sounds like God has a plan for Jonathan Skrmetti.
A plan and a rich sense of humor.
Yeah, always. Yeah. Always. So it was December when the case United States versus Skrmetti was filed, right? Tell us about that.
So our legislature got concerned. There were some media reports about gender-related transition surgeries and hormone treatments happening in Tennessee. Our General Assembly was very concerned about it. It was the first bill introduced in each house. Was a prohibition on juveniles receiving any of these treatments that are irreversible in many circumstances, life-altering, and really unproven. So we had a bipartisan supermajority of the legislature pass this bill that said if you're under 18, or if you're a doctor and you have a patient who's under 18, it is illegal for you to give them surgery or hormone treatment or puberty blockers for gender transition purposes, essentially. We were sued by the ACLU. We were sued by Lambda Legal. They had some local plaintiffs. The Department of Justice intervened. We lost at the district court, as everybody had to that point. We filed an emergency stay of the injunction, and we got the first win in any federal court allowing one of these laws to go into effect. We got a great opinion out of Chief Judge Sutton on the Sixth Circuit. And then we continued litigating, got another phenomenal opinion in that case. And then the DOJ and the ACLU sought cert, and I could not believe it.
Explain what that means for those of us who are not attorneys.
So to get a case in front of the U.S. Supreme Court, you don't have a guaranteed right to go up there. You have to ask the court to take the case. And it's very rare for the court to take any case. I think it's a 2 or 3%.
That's a minuscule percentage.
Rate. Yeah,
right?
I mean it's a long shot in most circumstances, except when the U.S. Department of Justice asks. They have a pretty good batting average at getting cases up there. And under the circumstances where we had a great opinion out of a very respected judge, we had a very capable litigation team, and this is an issue that's still, I think, relatively in its infancy. I mean, it's incredible how quickly the practice spread. I did not expect them to try to get the Supreme Court to take this case. I'm glad they did. We need clarity, not just in the medical context, but in all sorts of these gender-related areas. There are constitutional cases brought all the time. So this is the first constitutional case that the U.S. Supreme Court has taken looking at gender identity issues. And we had the argument in December. My extraordinarily capable Solicitor General, Matt Rice, argued the case for us. He clerked for Justice Thomas. It was his first argument up there, but he did a phenomenal job. And now we wait, and we probably wait until May or June, or maybe, I don't know if they do opinions in July, but my suspicion is this one will probably take a while.
Thank you for your courage on that, the courage of your fellow policymakers. They in the General Assembly in Tennessee. I can tell you at Heritage, we of course have been closely watching this case, and it's been so encouraging up to this point for us, just as a staff, not just our legal scholars of whom you are aware, but also those of us who are not attorneys and paying attention to the human side of the scourge that is gender transition, to see Tennessee's case succeed thus far. I mean, we'll see what the court decides. But that leads me to a second point about this, and it's top of mind for me, and this is about the human side. It's top of mind for me because at Heritage, what we try to do with all of the public policy that we do, the legal scholarship that we work on, is to put front and center the human faces. And I think as conservatives, we often do a poor job of that. I mean, we're really good with data. We're really good with arguments. You're a great example of those two things. I think you're also very good about putting the human face on things. But where I'm going with this is, recently at Heritage, we hosted for the third or fourth time a conference on fighting gender ideology. And there were 3 young women there who underwent gender transition. And if you spend some time with them, you know, the only way I know how to put this as a guy of faith is that you can see God's hand now in encouraging them to move forward in spite of the just ridiculous evil that was done to them. But it's very difficult for them, as I think any rational person can understand. Do you think that, this is the question, do you think that elevating these young people, giving them platforms to tell their stories, has been helpful for what does have to be an objective and rational legal assessment of what's going on with this situation?
I think it's critical because there are faces on the other side, and for a long time the narrative, and by the way, I mean, these are kids who are having a hard time, no matter which side of the issue politically you're on. Like, these are kids who are having a really hard time, and we can't forget that. But there are always kids on the other side of the issue coming out talking about how important the transition procedures are for them. And subjectively, that's probably true. I mean, there is some data showing that there may be a short-term psychological benefit for kids who are having a hard time. They're told this is going to help, and it's a natural reaction for them to think this is helping. But you see the longer-term scope of it, and the data supports this, but you really need that human face, the Chloes and the Precias of the world, to say, I was led down this primrose path. People said this was going to solve all my problems. They explained to me how all my problems were a result of me being in the wrong body and that changing my body would fix it. And to say that was a lie, and to explain their experiences going through these serious and to some extent irreversible changes, and how that has just been devastating for them. Because this is such a new process, I mean, there were a handful of people in the distant past who had these sort of interventions, but the numbers have flown up spectacularly, and the time horizon is too limited now to see just what the extent of the damage will be in the long run, how many people are going to have serious reservations. But the early indicators are it's going to happen for a lot of people. If you look at the data on mental well-being and suicide, we'll see how it develops, but there's real cause for concern there. And so having these brave first people to the table when there is a huge array of elite America against them, to have the courage to step up and say, this was all a lie and it has been horrible for me, it provides a counter narrative, it puts a face on it, and it really shows why people are so passionate about this. It's not some abstract bigotry about transphobia. It's about hurting children.
And it transcends political labels. I mean, I think about one other guest on this show over the last several months, Jennifer Say, who is a corporate executive in California, and was red-pilled, as the kids say, over the COVID lockdowns. And then once she started this journey, I don't think Jennifer would say that she's a political conservative, and that's okay. But in the conversation that she and I had, she said, her rejection of the big government, big corporation overwrought lockdowns in California led her to look at this gender ideology nonsense. And she does a very good job of putting a human face on it. For you, though, I want to ask a slightly different question because of your legal expertise. So we'll take two threads in this conversation. One, the human element of the gender transition, and a topic that I said earlier we were going to come back to, and that's federalism. What would you, as a thoughtful, friendly state attorney general, recommend to federal policymakers on ending the scourge of gender ideology? In other words, what's the proper role for the federal government there?
So it's a tricky question.
It is, and it's a little bit of a leading question, but it's not a gotcha one.
I mean, the converse of having the freedom to do what we want to do in Tennessee means that California has the freedom to be bonkers. They have policies that are abhorrent and that we think are really bad. Now, specifically with the medical interventions for kids, there is a lot of federal regulation over the funding of healthcare. There is significant opportunity with the spending clause to put in checks. But I think if we have the courage of our convictions here, it's a matter of looking at what the truth is. And the suppression of research at the federal level has been a significant factor. There's been a big thumb on the scale of what the medicine actually says, and that has been abetted by the federal bureaucracy. You see federal involvement in the publication of the WPATH guidelines with an eye towards leveraging the credibility of medical expertise toward influencing litigation and policymaking. So I don't think we need a heavy-handed federal government to come in and pass expansive laws that are potentially going to have problems under the Commerce Clause. I think what we need is a federal government committed to allowing medicine to move in directions that the science pushes it, rather than trying to steer it in a policy-oriented direction. And so I am very hesitant to say that when we control the federal government, that solves everything, because we are not always going to control the federal government on the right. And the second we don't, if we've given it the power to make these sweeping decisions, that power will be used against us. And it is much better to be able to make our states the places that we want them to be, rather than trying to force other people to do the things that we don't want.
I really love that response. Not that you need to hear that from me, but Heritage and I are Burkeans to our core. The most important political philosopher in my coming of age as a conservative was Russell Kirk. is Russell Kirk. We have a bust of Dr. Kirk in our building, as you no doubt know, and I think he would love that response because he abhorred this sort of knee-jerk reaction, even by some conservatives, and it's legitimate on sort of a human level to use D.C., to use the federal government all the time, and of course some of that's appropriate. But to ask a clarifying question, not even so much like pushing back on your response, which I think was exceptional. What do you do about funding? Like right now, as we sit here recording this in early 2025, not only for the one big beautiful bill or the two big beautiful bills that will be reconciliation, but also debt ceiling, budget considerations, agency considerations the rest of this year. This issue is going to come up. It sounds to me that two things can be true. Your wonderful response about being careful about using federal power, being responsible, while also recognizing that where the federal government, where Congress has the authority, which is over funding, that they need to be bold. Am I putting words in your mouth?
No, I mean, and I think there's a difference between mandating people to spend money on certain things and putting limits on how federal money can be used. And I think that's a really important consideration. The jurisprudence around the spending clause is very underdeveloped. And I think there's reason to think that as a check on the scope of the federal government, we'll see more and more litigation in that area. I vigorously intend to bring litigation in that area, and I may even file some amicus briefs in support of the Californias of the world in some of their litigation they're already saying is going to happen, highlighting some of these issues. Because in the long run, it's not whether we win or lose on any one issue. It's about constraining the federal power altogether so that we are free to make our decisions as the people of our sovereign states about many areas. The federal government is important, and it has an important role, but our whole system is predicated on avoiding the concentration of power.
Another topic that you have great expertise in is cyber law, which in some interesting ways is connected to this conversation thus far. Tell us about not only your expertise there, but what the average ordinary American who's rather extraordinary in his and her gifts needs to know about the present and the future of cyber law.
So first of all, I'll push back. I don't know that I'm an expert, but I'm an aficionado. My dad was getting his computer science degree when I was a kid, so we had a PC from when I was about 3 years old, and I play a lot of video games. I still do.
So your expertise in cyber law is from video games.
That was the origin of it. Yes,
I love your honesty.
Should have pursued that as a career. It would have been a whole lot more lucrative. But when I was in Memphis, they needed someone to teach cyber law over at the University of Memphis. I'd taken it when I was in law school. I really liked it. There's nobody else around who was particularly up for teaching it, and so I held up a hand and taught it for 3 years and really enjoyed it, never knowing I'd actually get involved in these things. But when you look at the structure of information flow, there are a very small number of companies that control a huge amount of the conversation. And when you live in a constitutional republic or any sort of democratic government, it's the interplay of ideas between people that ultimately drives what the government does. And so when there are people who are constraining that interplay, who are trying to shape the conversation, that's always going to happen to some extent. It happens with newspapers, happens with TV news. But when so much information goes through so few channels, the ability for malfeasance, the ability for a slim monoculture that controls very little of the population, but a whole lot of what the population hears, the opportunity to undermine the ability of our system to function presents itself. And we saw some of that. And so my concern there is it's exactly the same principle that we talk about in federalism. It's that the concentration of power is inherently evil. Even if you have good people with a lot of power, either those people aren't going to stay in place or they will be corrupted by it. And so you need checks and balances. We did not really have that with the, I guess, Internet 2.0, Web 2.0, I don't know what you call it. But when you had the Googles and the Facebooks controlling so much of the conversation, back when Twitter was part of the monoculture, it was terrible for America. And you started to see this massive divide between the elites and the American people who were not holding the levers of power that was extremely corrosive to our ability to function as a country. I suspect that was driven in part by our foreign adversaries, but regardless of the cause, it was bad. We're seeing the backlash. I've been involved in some antitrust litigation, which is bipartisan. It's great to do bipartisan things you can feel good about. It doesn't happen a lot these days. But we brought suit against Google. We brought suit against Meta. The Meta case didn't go so well. The Google case, we got a finding of liability. We're moving toward remedies now. But the pushback is necessary as a check, just as every other part of our system needs checking.
Thank you for giving us that summary. I know many folks in the audience will be grateful for that. You know, by the way, your story about how you came to be teaching cyber law in Memphis reminds me of when I was a young history professor. I'm an early American historian, and I'm also a rabid sports fan, as we were talking about off camera. And so when I was early in my career, the business school came to me, which was in a totally different college in this university, and said, Roberts, you decent teacher, you like sports, would you teach the history of sports class? And so to this gentleman who was not my dean, and so this is just totally out of bounds for this young untenured history professor, I said, sure. So then about a month later, my department head gets this notice that I'm teaching the history of sports, and he came in and he said, you can't do that. I said, come on, it's a free country. It's a history class. Well, he had a legitimate complaint. I was robbing him of whatever American history class I was going to be teaching. But we ended up working it out, and ultimately it came down to this. I introduced myself and to the students, and they all thought I was like this expert in the history of sport. And I was having to cram so much the night before to go into that. But it's a good way of reminding ourselves that we're never too old to learn a new interest, if not expertise. That's also, perhaps unintentionally, a segue into another arena where you have been active, and that's the NCAA, one of my least favorite institutions in the history of sports.
So I think I'm not an elected attorney general, but if I was, I think the NCAA would single-handedly guarantee me re-election.
Yes.
So we've had problems with them in Tennessee for a while. They were extraordinarily arbitrary and unfair to Memphis for quite some time. And then in UT, they had a legitimate...
The other UT, Tennessee.
The real UT. If you look at the SEC identifies schools, and there's a UT and there's a Tex, but we're very proud of our colony to the southwest.
I'll be polite and let you keep speaking.
But, the NCAA it's sort of exactly what we talked about in terms of the concentration of power driving bad conduct. There are good people involved. There are good people, well-intentioned people who want to use this organization to promote education, to give kids great opportunities. But the enforcement is so arbitrary. It's so opaque. There are agendas at work there, and there are not checks on them. So when UT had a real problem, and we had a chancellor come in and absolutely clean house, she was held up as the gold standard for how a university should respond to scandal. She did everything right, and the NCAA recognized it as such. And then they turned around and tried to impose a bowl ban as a result in violation of their own guidelines. And so I threatened to sue them, and they backed off. But then with NIL, the name, image, and likeness issue, where college athletes are entitled to receive compensation for their intellectual property rights, there's been a mess. It's the Wild West. We had the president of the NCAA at one point saying there are no rules. Like, what rules for NIL? It's just wide open out there. Well, a couple months later, the enforcement folks started knocking at a few different doors, and one of them was the University of Tennessee. They were looking at some allegations of NIL malfeasance in recruitment. But, of course, the rules were just ridiculous. They were not clear. They were not enforced. And they were also in violation of federal antitrust law. So when the enforcers came knocking, we took a look at the case. I had an incredible team working on it. They put together an antitrust suit, and we ended up enjoining the NCAA's enforcement of any NIL rules in Tennessee or involving Tennessee student athletes. And the system is in transition, right? Nobody's saying that what we have now is perfect. I would love to go back to the days of, you throw on your leather helmet, you grab a couple buddies from the dorm next door, and you go give heck to those jerks from, the state across the border. But that's not where we live. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry. These kids are putting their bodies on the line. They deserve to be fairly compensated because they're creating huge value for everybody else. And when you have a system that says they can get a little bit of money, but they can't really negotiate, they can't consider that as they're deciding which school to go to. They can only figure that out after the fact. That's depriving them of the benefit of the market forces that everybody else in the college sports industry is profiting from.
Two things. Number one, thanks for your courage in taking on the NCAA. It is now politically popular, but there was a time when the NCAA had a much greater popularity that would be fraught with a lot of risk. But the second thing is, to your great point about compensating these players, it's not a surprise to our audience members. My knee-jerk reaction is to be a fuddy-duddy conservative. And so 10 years ago, when this was being theorized about paying players, I thought, that's terrible. They're students. They just need to go be students and be athletes. And I've been persuaded, completely. I entirely agree with you that it's a matter of justice for this to happen. And the NCAA is not at all helpful, to say the least. And yet, while I readily and enthusiastically agree with all of that, I worry about whether this system can continue, because, and I won't go too far afield there, but I worry that it's changed the integrity of the sport, whatever the sport may be, but particularly the high revenue ones. I'm happy for the players themselves, but just as a fan, forget being a policy person, just as a fan, I think it's really undermining the integrity of the athletics. And I wonder if, having just watched the FCS championship game between Montana State and North Dakota State, that's a better product than, I wouldn't say necessarily the college football playoff, but I think more fans will be gravitating to what they see as more pure examples of their respective sports, is the point.
Well, and there's a joy that comes from amateurism. This is really an area where Congress needs to act because there are a lot of competing interests, there are a lot of competing values, and the resolution for that should be through our political process. We have antitrust laws that currently prevent a lot of the kind of internal regulation that I think the NCAA would like to impose. I think you get a broader perspective when Congress looks at this. You get more legitimacy. And so the failure of our legislative branch to live up to its co-equality this is an example of that playing out. And I know there are members of Congress that are interested. Senator Blackburn from Tennessee has been very engaged in this issue. But ultimately, legislation really does look like the answer here.
Let's cover one final policy topic, although I would sit here all day and have these conversations with you about these different topics, and that's ESG, environmental social governance. You've also been very courageous on that. Where does that stand as it relates to the people of Tennessee, whom you represent, but also more broadly for the United States and, for that matter, for the West?
So I'm going to sound like a broken record here, but it's all about the concentration of power. The ESG stuff that we've seen playing out very literally happened when a small group of super rich people at Davos decided they were going to save the world. And they're leveraging their control over the financial system in a way that prohibits people from doing what they don't like and encourages people to do what they like in a way that looks very much like policymaking, except there's no accountability. It's an opaque group of people using power in ways that the public has no control over, no insight into, and they're able to defund people who are doing what they don't want. They're able to force even really big companies to move in the directions they want. When you have a substantial amount of any given company owned by the same small group, or not owned, actually emphatically not owned, but managed by the same small group of asset managers, listening to the same small group of proxy advisors, a few people can really steer the direction of industries, not just companies, but industries. And it's bad for America. You're not getting the full input of everybody. Some people are more insulated from things like the shock of rising oil prices or the reliability of power. Some people greatly value climate outcomes in a way that, I think most Republicans care about climate, they care about environmental issues, but not in a religious apocalyptic sense. And meanwhile, you have a few people with a lot of power over the economy who have decided that this is a priority. And this is, it's not some shadowy organization, right? It's BlackRock. Like, we know who they are. State Street. They're identifiable companies, and they made a decision. And I think it was a really well-intentioned decision. I think they thought, by golly, this is a crisis. We can do something about it. We need to do something about it. Without having the perspective of, we're just a few people, there are a lot of considerations at play here. That's why we have democratic institutions. We need to make sure that everybody's concerns are taken into account. We need to make sure that there is buy-in as to the legitimacy of these decisions. And so what we're seeing in ESG and the response is a big pushback of popular sovereignty reasserting itself, saying, you're certainly allowed to try to make money. Like, we encourage you to do that. It's great. If you want to use the money that you make to push for political outcomes, that's your right as an American. But you can't use your control over the financing of a variety of industries to collude with the other people who have similar power to push everybody to do what you want. That sort of collusion violates our antitrust laws. It also violates the fundamental principles of democracy. So it's been a hot issue. Like the gender stuff, it came up very quickly. There were a lot of big changes that happened fast. We're seeing the swing back pretty quickly, and I'm optimistic that we will largely have solved the ESG problem within the next year or two.
I am too. Heritage has been not only involved, but I think playing a leading role along with some other organizations in combating ESG. And what I see is that the greatest disadvantage that those of us who were fighting the ESG nonsense had as recently as 5 years ago has dissipated. And it's this: regular Americans, including people who were involved in some public policy fights, did not understand that the implementation of ESG practices affected everyone. You might be a public employee in the state of Texas, of all states, and I say that because of its conservatism, like Tennessee's. But those investments, prior to some really courageous moves by statewide officials like yourself, meant that no longer would these people be disadvantaged, just these account holders. And so telling that story, sort of going back to the human element of this, I think has been very important. So General Skrmetti, I've got two final questions for you for now, but we look forward to maybe going on location to Nashville and visiting you and your staff. This has been excellent. So thanks for your generosity and your responses. The first is a little more short term than the second question, is about federalism. We're recording this in early 2025. You and I are both conservatives. We're excited about the Trump-Vance administration coming in. Where's the conservative movement going to be in 4 years, particularly as it relates to federalism? In other words, what do your counterparts in other states and you yourself need to emphasize, knowing we have a very friendly administration in D.C.?
So I think there's a lot of opportunity to redraw the lines and to have the federal government itself assert limits on federal authority. I think you're going to see a lot of tension there. Because in terms of policy, there are things that people really, really, really want to do. But in terms of structure, we need to make sure that we're not conceding too much, because that power will be used against us, and probably sooner than we think, certainly sooner than we hope. So there will be an ongoing debate, I think, within the administration and within the conservative sphere generally about how best to do this. I think there's also a really interesting realignment going on, and I don't know how that plays out. But federalism is the answer to a lot of our problems. If you see some parts of the conservative movement and some parts of the country move more in one direction, better to have each of the disparate elements have its place and have its ability to live out its vision than try to have a huge fight at the federal level and force everyone to go in one direction. I mean, we allow for differences in our system, and it's important that we continue to do so.
Final question is also a custom on this show, which is trying to figure out why a particular guest is hopeful about the American future, it, of course, presumes that the guest is hopeful about the American future. Sitting with you, even though we've just met, you strike me as someone who is hopeful just generally, and I'm very grateful for that, although it'd be okay if you weren't. But this is a little bit of a nuanced question now because for those of us who are conservatives, we're grateful for the electoral victory. We're grateful for what we see as the early signs of cabinet selections and policy priorities of the new administration. And yet we also know that not everything is going to be perfect. What advice do you give to people in the audience, wherever they live, Tennessee, Texas, Virginia, state of Washington, maybe internationally, about how they can participate in making sure that this opportunity that we've been given actually is realized?
I mean, I think the most important thing that people can bring is perspective. I think if you're focused on the short term, you're never going to get what you want in the long run. And so people need to be thinking not in terms of what is the shiny object immediately in front of me. They need to be thinking in terms of how do I help build the America that my great-great-grandchildren will thrive in. And so stepping back and not getting pulled into whatever the big X fight of the day is, not consuming all of their energy fighting over short-term stuff, but really looking at how we can fundamentally solve the problems that we have and create opportunities going forward. And that means reading more history. It means having conversations with people. And ultimately, the most important thing that anybody can do is teach kids about why America is great. Even now, as we're ascendant, we need the perspective of creating an enduring prosperity and enduring freedom. And that means that we always have to be thinking about passing it forward.
Attorney General Jonathan Skrmetti, thank you for your time, for your courage, for your service. We look forward to seeing what you will be doing in the remaining years of your term as Tennessee's Attorney General and what happens after that.
Thank you.
I know you enjoyed that conversation as much as I did. I want to home in on one thing General Skrmetti said in terms of advice, and that is reading more history, keeping perspective. There will be a lot of political and policy fights coming up. We're going to win most of them, those of us who are conservatives, but we're going to lose some of them. And when we lose them, keeping that perspective, as he said, I think is vital because ultimately the United States is the greatest experiment in the history of the world. Think about our pluralism. Think about all of the reasons we have not to succeed. I've been telling you for 3 years we're winning, and it's very evident from this conversation that we are. Keep your chin up. Take care.
The Kevin Roberts Show is brought to you by more than 10 million supporters of the Heritage Foundation. The executive producer is Crystal Kate Bonham. Sound design by Lauren Evans, Mark Guiney, Tim Kennedy, and Joseph Fonspakowski. For more information and to subscribe, please visit heritage.org.